I'm Clay Smith. I'm the literary director here at the Library of Congress, and we're thrilled that you're here for another night that we call Live at the Library. This is what we do every Thursday night. We sort of leave the library open late. We serve drinks and food and encourage you to walk through the different exhibitions and, of course, attend events like this one. So we hope you see you back on future Thursday nights. Last year, right around this time, we featured Washington Post Book World critic Ron Charles in conversation with poet Major Jackson. And that was sort of our restart of a series that we had done with Ron called Life of a Poet. That series took place at the Hill Center just down the street and ended due to the COVID pandemic, but we're really happy to have Ron back and here in the historic Thomas Jefferson Building. A couple of housekeeping items. First, please take a moment to turn off or silence your mobile devices. And second, I wanted to let you know that this event will not include an audience Q&A. It does include a book signing with Doug at the end of the event in the back of the room here. So tonight we're welcoming poet Douglas Kearney to the library. Doug is the author of 8 books ranging from poetry to essays. In 2023, Optic Subwoof, a collection of his Bagley Wright lectures, won the Poetry Foundation's Pegasus Prize for Poetry Criticism and the CLMP Firecracker Award for Creative Nonfiction. His 7th book, Show, was a Griffin Poetry Prize and Minnesota Book Award winner, and he is the Samuel Russell Chair in the Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts and Professor of English at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Kearney's forthcoming collection of visual poems, I Imagine I've Been Science Fiction Always, is scheduled to be published by Wave Books in April. I'm really thrilled to tell you all that Douglas will be talking about I Imagine I've Been Science Fiction Always for the first time. And he will show images tonight from the collection as part of this event. So thanks to our friends at Wave Books. We also have copies of the collection for you to purchase if you'd like to 2 months before anybody else. And in the poetry world, that is what we call breaking news. Yes. So that's all for me. Let's welcome Ron and Doug to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for coming out on such a brutally cold night. And thank you for being here, Doug.
Oh, it is my pleasure.
Doesn't seem that cold to you, though, does it?
No, this is adorable. But, you know, it was Southern California before this, so I have...
You can remember when
I
it's so
can
cold?
remember,
Okay.
yeah.
I want you to think back to when you first began to think of yourself as a poet. What was that like?
Wow.
When you conceived of that as a possibility.
So the idea that was a pursuit
Yes.
unto itself
Yes.
actually came really late for me. I would say maybe in my early 20s.
Oh. After college?
After college.
Oh.
I had written, I went to Howard, and so I went to school with folks like Yona Harvey and, Ta-Nehisi Coates and Kim Powers. And there were already folks like Ethelbert Miller there who were just so deeply committed. And there was a huge poetry scene in DC, and I imagine there still is, but with folks like DJ Renegade and Brian Gilmore. But the idea that was like a thing
Yes.
that you could, once you finished college, that there was more you could do, beyond just like putting on all black and like sitting someplace, like writing.
Right.
That was rather late. And I will say that the 2 things that made it possible for me to think of that was one, was the poetry of Harriet Mullen. Harriet Mullen, I always describe her work as being serious play.
Okay.
Right? She's doing a lot of signifying, a lot of puns, a lot of kind of social critique through this kind of dazzling, like, collage of language.
Right.
And so that was like, I was like, okay. So just thinking about how a certain word can travel not only through vocabulary, but through cultural valences, and that could be a poem. And then that would turn me back to some of my favorite, like, you know, MCs and things like that from hip hop, you know, like people like Trugoy the Dove, the late Trugoy the Dove, you know, who had a line that went something like, I got the element H to the 2, so you owe me what's coming when I'm raining on your new parade. Like the H to the 2, H2O, of course, we get that one, but also HH, hip hop, owe me, you know, you're in debt when I'm raining on your new parade. So this idea of flow in hip hop is oftentimes associated with liquid. Like rapping itself, rapping is flow, is spitting, is all these different things. So hearing that and recognizing that that was just like a moment in a 4 or 5 minute song, right? But just that little formulation, like a poet could A, build something entirely of that, or B, just go towards that and get deeper and deeper and deeper into that kind of a moment. And that, for me, is when I was like, okay, I think I can do this.
Do that.
I think I can do this, yeah.
For a living.
I mean, you know. I mean, you know, I have this side hustle as a university professor.
Teaching
You know,
thing,
yeah,
yeah.
you know. You know, sometimes that encroaches on my, no, but yeah, I mean, just like, you know, I taught at Cal Arts for a while, and I was a student at Cal Arts, and I remember reading some of the promotional material for Cal Arts when they first started it, right? And there was this very fascinating kind of parsing where they were talking about, we are here to train professional artists. Now, but then there was a quick, when we say professional, we don't necessarily mean they're being paid to do it, right? But that they have professed,
Oh.
right? Because, like, you know, in the art world, like, the idea of being a professional is suddenly very low. You know, like, that's design, that's graphic design, which also happens to be one of my loves. But that idea that there was a level of commitment you could give to something, irrespective of whether that was how you earned your money, that was an idea I had prior. But going to Cal Arts really made it possible for me to imagine, right, that one can be a practicing artist, because that was sort of the demand at Cal Arts. You got to be a practicing artist and a faculty member. And so that was an important part of it for me. So I'd say it was a kind of a slow
Nice.
rolling over. But when it happened, I was like, oh God, I could do this. You could do this.
Very good. I want you to read a poem.
Oh, okay.
It's a long time ago for you. Maybe
what?
your first book.
Oh, whoa. Oh, okay. Yeah.
2006?
2006? Yeah.
A previous life in LA.
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, you know, I wrote this poem from the house I grew up in Altadena. So if y'all have heard about the Eaton fires, that's my literal hometown. And so this poem, which is called The Orange Alert, and I'll read it, is of course referencing, you know, so like the terrorism alerts that we were experiencing.
After 9/11.
After 9/11. But then also thinking about fires. All right, so the Orange Alert. Picture the upturned millipede dead and see the streets of Altadena. Palm tree rows against the concrete, stiff to the horizon. There have been no birds big enough, we are comforted, to pluck the chitons from before our yards and vanish into the sun like dog-fighting MiGs. War bears litters of similes. Altadena, smog hugs the foothills like mustard gas, where our rich peer through their blinds into ravines. Santanas sway the mustard plants, yuccas, bob, some man, his cigarette, a full gas can, an itch. We've known the Orange Alert. Fires reaching for helicopters like cartoon cats clawing at panicked birds. Yesterday, fire engines and hazmat trucks jostled at Alameda and El Molino like beetles eating a four-legged spider. That morning, radios warned of orange. Neighborhood kids watched officers climb in and out an open manhole, consulting the entrails of the great dead millipede. We watched the ground, the sun hotter than all year. The mountains hid Santanas. The smog went orange with dusk, the growing shadows of lingering birds.
Your friends and family okay out there?
So, my father passed away in 2017, and the house I grew up in was sold in 2018. My grandmother, who was the first of the family to move to Altadena with my grandfather, passed away a little bit later, but had moved out of her house. But most of my friends from middle school, I mean, honestly, from primary school, middle school, through high school, many of their parents still lived in town, and some of them had managed to buy their family homes or buy other homes, and they're gone.
It's unimaginable, the pictures.
I mean, so I have probably my closest friend from high school. The night, I guess it would be Tuesday, January, I want to say 8th, maybe the 7th, it's one of those, was racing back home from a conference in Las Vegas because his family was being evacuated. I called him, I texted him on that night and just like check on him and to like be like, yeah, I agree, you should probably leave. Because sometimes people, it's wild the times that we suddenly think, but my job though, like I get it, you need that job. But to sit there and kind of go like, can I go home from this? I think that's something. But, I texted him, and then I followed up with him on Thursday. He said, yeah, it's totally gone. It's all gone.
It's just,
Yeah.
that poem has not aged at all.
No.
I wanted to start with it because it looks like a poem.
Yes.
It has lines on a page.
Exactly.
It has metaphors and similes.
And imagery. That's not the actual typography.
It builds to a theme.
I mean, yeah, right?
The experience of you reading it and me reading it on the page are very close together.
Yes, exactly.
That will not be the case later today. You know his work. You know what's coming.
Yeah.
It will not be that. I want you to read another poem, a little bit
We'll
longer.
start somewhere, though. Yes. All right. Okay. So this is Blanche Bruce Does the Modernism. And Blanche Bruce was the name of, I think, the first representative? Black senator from Mississippi to be here. And then Blanche Bruce is also the alter ego of the late performer, musician, visual artist, Terry Adkins. And we were working on a project together, and he died during that process. So Blanche Bruce Does the Modernism. Let us go then, I said, and the band was I lone. Every which way, my spit slick, the sax's brass chitlins, I said. Such wet wood, mud dust, and soil red rock, I said. Doors to some room, blown out the out, blown in. Let us go then, I said. Check the spit's phlegm, tenements. I said, it's slow typhoon syrup. It blooms, the axe up, and loam's gypsum, I said. Earth's marble bastard. Let us go then, I said. Preference of red or white, I said. My spit, where I was where to be when I was there. What I made was it, since it was where it was, wasn't it, I said. But the body mustn't be there, I said. But the shapes are there, I said. Here's what we'll do. Let us go then, wailing and wailing till one was off the chain. I said, fuck it, keeping time in a gorilla suit for the mud to come on. I said, up 77, and took it to the bridge to throw down wet, I said. Mold on that alabarble, a salad, a crop gaining on you in a gorilla suit, I said. Gaining on you, I said. I'll take my time and yours in the bandstand garden. Out, let us go then, and then we.
Wow. Wow. You see what's happening. It's happening already. The experience of hearing him read that poem is not like me reading it on the page. Mm-hmm. It's starting to diverge. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Am I wrong to hear allusions to T.S. Eliot's Proof Rock?
You are not wrong at all.
Let us go then, you and I.
Yeah, Dumb Certain Half Deserted Springs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so.
That's the modernism you're referring to.
That is the modernism I'm referring to. And really interestingly, right, both Eliot and Pound would sometimes correspond to each other using the voices of black minstrelsy. They would respond. So when you hear
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So the musical Cats.
So Pound is even worse than we thought.
I mean, there are so many reasons why Pound. The musical Cats is of course based upon T.S. Eliot's book of children's poems called Old Possum's Guide to Book of Practical Cats. But Old Possum was his character. Was the minstrel character that he would use when he was writing to Pound. So that history, right? Like most early 20th century animated cartoon characters. It's pulled directly out of minstrelsy.
So how are you responding to Prufrock in that poem, or to modernism in general?
So the first poem I wrote that was responding consciously to Eliot, and by sort of association, Prufrock, was a poem I wrote in 2000 called "Carjacking J. Alfred Prufrock," and that didn't get very far. Like you write things, you write them, they exist. It's all building towards a thing. But for me, I do have a certain kind of ambivalence, right, to Eliot. On the one hand, and Prufrock in particular, right, like that poem has meant a lot to me. There's a poem in my first book called Living Room, and it was a poem about when my mother was she had pancreatic cancer in 1995, and of course by the time we knew it, it was already kind of too late.
All right.
And she was at my grandmother's house up in Altadena, and we were watching a movie while she was convalescing. And I got up to turn off the movie, and I tripped over the tube that delivered the morphine to her arm. And in that moment, I literally kind of turned as like my father and my grandmother, the two people who loved her most, right, in the world, were both kind of like this. And I turned and looked at my grandmother, and I balled up my fist. I said, "I know!" So I wrote that poem's first draft probably in, I want to say, 1996. Mm-hmm. Fearsome came out in 2006. And I'd revised that poem a number of times. It was in the manuscript that was going to be published, but it still wasn't right. And I know one of the questions that people oftentimes ask, if they do ask craft questions, like, what's your revision process? And so I just want to say, I've been revising that poem, again, for roughly 10 years. And I was looking at it, and I was going like, either I'm going to get it this time, either I'm going to do with it what I need to do with it, or I'm just kind of done. I'm going to break it or whatever. And the poem that I read to put me in the right headspace was The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, because there's a lot of like simple rhyme, like single syllabic rhyme in that. But the effect of it for me isn't a kind of jaunty jingling. It is like kind of hypnotizing. Seductive. And so I read that and used that in my head as a way of thinking about how to approach the rhyme and the prosody of the whole thing. But I go back to that poem in particular quite a lot. Not as much in the last maybe decade, but prior to that, kind of like the first 10 years of me professing, right, to poetry, that poem was really important to me, and it was something that I've cited or referred to several times.
I just got the anthology from the New Yorker, the Centennial Anthology of Poetry. It's big, 1,200 pages. It's got a great introduction by Kevin Young.
Yeah.
And he writes, this is the editor of this anthology, the editor of the New Yorker's poetry section. He writes, with a few exceptions, the New Yorker didn't publish any poet who wasn't white for nearly its first 75 years. That's the Harlem Renaissance?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
The Black Arts poets? No. Such omissions or metaphoric redlining are not only not accidental, but look more and more like a systemic failure of the imagination. In a poem you wrote called The Post, you ask sarcastically through that poem, America is different now, isn't it? America is so different now, isn't it? Yes. Is this too big a question, but how does your work push back against that historic exclusion of black voices? I mean, that is too big a question, and yet I have asked it.
I mean, I accept it.
Okay.
I accept it. I mean, so earlier, when we talked about the Orange Alert, you noted that like this is a poem that's still fresh. Well, that it's still kind of afresh, and that's still, I mean, like, I wrote a poem, a visual poem about the Watts uprisings of the late 60s, 2 days before Chauvin murdered George Floyd. Like, I think the thing, if you are a writer, absolutely I think this is true if you're a writer from the African diaspora, African American writing. The question is oftentimes, are you being prescient? Or are you just remembering? Right? Like the second book of mine that was actually published called The Black Automaton, and it came out in 2009, but I finished it, say 2007, 2008. And like so many, and this is why The Post is an important poem for me, like so many, I was like, okay, I know better than this. I know better, but like, what if, Barack Obama becoming president, like, what if that like makes this book like not, like, what if it's now, it's like past, like, how would I feel? And I was like, oh, I never have to worry about that. The United States is always happy to oblige the freshness of Black poetry, of social protest and just living, right? So in some ways, things like that are evergreen, I think that as a poet who is oftentimes, if not outright questioning or making parodies of or alluding to or referencing a wide swath of voices, whether they're rappers, whether they're other poets, like I published a book, not a CD poet, like spoken word artists, whether they're visual artists, cartoon characters.
Right.
Like, I do feel a lot of times like my poems themselves are kind of like these sort of raucous house parties or like DJ sets, right? And so that presence, I try not to show up alone, right?
That's a great phrase.
Yeah, like I just try to, show up with people that, I'm interested in, that I respect. Sometimes people who I'm like frenemies with, but yeah, so I try to make the space of my poems into these kind of, these raucous collectives, yeah.
Performative typography is a phrase you've, I suppose, invented, right?
I mean, maybe, I think, yeah.
And that is what we call, what he's doing in his new collection, the upcoming collection, I should say, not the new one, the upcoming collection. I imagine I've been science fiction always. Can you show the audience some of these so they know what we're talking about? Because not everyone has seen these.
Absolutely. So we're just going to advance a couple of pages. And this is all the front matter right now.
A reviewer in Poetry Magazine says your typographically dynamic poems have the rambunctious exactitude of lightning strikes.
You got it. Book critics are
That's okay.
are lovely humans.
That's a good line.
So this is a performative typography, right?
Something more radical than
Oh yeah, we're getting there.
Okay.
We're getting there because you got to start off like this. I mean, one of the things that was interesting about the book show is it didn't feature as much of the kind of performative typography, and a lot of the people who reviewed it noticed that and said, oh, like he seems to have abandoned the typographic experiments. But no, so a part of why I imagine I've been science fiction always works the way it does was kind of like that moment where it's like, if you'd recognize Douglas Kearney from Show, like my departure album, like 9 books in, essentially. But this is what I would call performative typography. This is done in a software program called InDesign. And I'm saying that less as a way of boosting their signal, but more as a way of saying, this is actually one of the pieces of software that most books you read is designed in. You have the typefaces that you choose, and you can arrange them the way you like. But I'll kind of leave it on this page for a while. I think that's a fun one. But all of that is one typeface, right? And it's just arranged. InDesign uses like little boxes. And you can put one letter in a box, you can put a whole word in a box, however you want to do it.
Tilt them.
Arrange it, tilt it, space them, do all
What
that.
did people say people you respect, what did they say when you showed them these things?
I mean, the early stuff, like a lot of these really kind of came out with the book, The Black Automaton, the second book. And like the question is always, right? how do you read this? How do I read this?
How do I quote it if I'm going to review it?
Well, and that's another thing, right? That is, of course, a challenge that I've learned. sort of like, oh yeah, okay, there's that part, yeah. I imagine a person could take a PDF and do a detail, like the same way an art critic might work.
We might be able to do that.
Right, maybe, right? But yeah, and like the literal answer to that, with the poems from the Black Automaton, whenever I do a poetry reading, and I would read from that.
You read this?
Oh yeah, I would read something like that. Yeah. With the Black Automaton, like I would give a copy of the book or a page photocopied from the book and a pen to a member of the audience. And I would say, sequence this book. Now this is super hyperbolic, this one here. That's like really pushing that. But I never just picked up that book of poems. I actually mean never. Like even as I was writing it, I didn't go like, there's no master reading of those poems. So the audience member would put a 1 where they wanted me to start, and then maybe a 2 in the next place, and then maybe they'd go, if they wanted me to say where they started again, they'd put a 3 there.
So it's completely unstable.
Completely unstable. And as somebody who at some level was building a reputation as like a good performer of the work, I'm looking at this for 10 seconds in front of the audience and trying to make sure that I know where 1, 2, 3, and 4 are. Right? Because if I get to 1, 2, 3, and 4, and now I'm scanning around for 5, there were times where while I was reading it, I was, doing my kind of momentum thing, and then I get to 5, I'm like, though, and then I have to jump to like 6. And sometimes audience members wouldn't put a number next to a section at all, so I just didn't read that part. And I literally did it that way for like 5 years.
So you could read this to us now.
I mean, I could do a pretty good approximation, I think.
Would you?
Yeah, sure. Do you mind advancing it as I go? Because that way the people can see what we're doing.
Okay, do I know how to do it?
Yeah, here we go. So just the right arrow. And if not, if you miss anything, like don't worry, we're remixing live. All right. This is I Imagine I've Been Science Fiction Always, and this is a poem that's written in a mode called a robot voice poem, which a former student of mine, Teo Rivera Dundas, created in a class about creating new forms. And what you do is you basically write a poem, then you record yourself reading that poem. Then you put the poem through a randomizing engine online. You take that text and you kind of put it after the previous text. You read that, and you do that one more time, and then you do it. So yeah, let's try it. I been queried in my nature, then answered, why I'm opposite to an objectionable object whipped up as such. To uselessness I was, to wit, instrumental, to be played out, NBC, a pianola, e.g., I play myself. Ha, this vernacular. Ha, this literal. Ha, it's complex, but this itness needful. Figure me a simple machine, I'd flex some pull, have leverage, could screw with their jive, theirness, yes, lay plain their intention. But complex, what one call equivocation. Smoke, that's lexical. Complex, as in got me a complex off of my nature as fixed, opposite. Complex, prison, industrial. But is there need to need some opposite nature to be being complex? One could work janky shit up in that word, complex. They pass off that shit as natural shit, which shit, their shit need my nature opposite. Opposite to what? Yes, dear interlocutor. Swear I ain't natural by their uncanny shit. That supernatural, forged as both object and their jury-rigged figment. I imagine I've been science fiction always, even as was they done, sailed, unidentified, floating obscenities, to whom that natural. Sure as shit it's shady, calling all those tall ships kin, kith, isn't we forged from the same industry? See, a pianola, they pass off that shit as prisoners. That's the way I ain't a natural machine. I flexible. Were I forced to answer for my nature, call me batty, but I'd aver maybe 50-50. Odds you'd find some nature to me. Seems what's in me's too haphazard for blood. It's nature's contingent, which I means to say it mess some hands ain't hardly ever blood. Rather shit, some register of shit. Industrial complex. What's lexical complex? But we see it at my feet, running like it can't wait to break north from out me. Right then, right there, it's blood. Thus, I don't guess that shit they spot me with his flesh. Yet it sure isn't not. See, a pianola, swear I ain't natural, prison haphazard machine, I'd flex and pull, they pass off that shit, never blood, never shit, by the figure and figure objection, one opposite nature, they spot me at, I imagine I've been science fiction always, I imagine I've been science fiction, I imagine been science fiction always, I imagine I've been science fiction always, I imagine I've been science fiction. Always been. I imagine science fiction. Been always. I imagine fiction. I've been science fiction. Always. I imagine I was been science fiction. Always industrial. That's lexical complex. It's complex. Plain. Their intention. X odds. You'd find some nature. Objectionable. Uncanny shit. It's my industrial. This is flesh. I force to X odds. You'd find some nature. Simple. I force to. Ass ain't. Location. I imagine. I imagine I science fiction always. I imagine I science fiction always. I science fiction always. I imagine I'm science. I imagine I'm science fiction. I imagine I'm science fiction always. I imagine I'm science fiction always. Jury rig play always myself. Swear I ain't natural. Prison too haphazard. See a pianola machine. I flex and pull. They pass off that shit as by their never and shit my objection. Never some opposite nature as they spot me. I imagine fiction. Imagine science always. I imagine science always. Imagine I always industrial. I always complex fiction. Some candy shit. That's laid. Playing their intention. Complex. What the complex? Objectionable. Mess some chance ain't already. X ain't hardly. X odds you find some nature with its flesh. Sipper. Where I forced to. Too batty there. Lay what's I'm off. It's too left viz. I'm that my butt. To answer, but sure too. Ain't off the. Yes, they can. Okay, I flesh sale. Watch. I shuck some flex. They could flex complex as was some average. I have some always science fiction image. Imagine I always fiction. I fiction. Object nature. Science fiction. Always pianola. A pianola. See a machine. I flex and pull. Swear I natural fiction. They pass off that shit's prison. I've been by their never blood and right there. From odds with opposite figure. I imagine it. They made me fly blood. They hands with passes out. Natural as it seems like scenes, but what they got imagine. See, I don't can't imagine. Often outside the bed, fiction. I always imagine science fiction. Indeed full. Been science fiction. Science fiction. It industrial. Imagine that's lexical. Always complex. Lay playing their intention. Uncanny shit. Objectionable. Science facts of some ain't hardly ever. Smoking for or batty. Inventive. My opposite of hazard. As to a blood. Flex. I play as was object major. My father. Envy. Need. Compass. Some. Jive. Shit. Me fiction. I don't maybe fiction. I was a figure. Luckier. I was so fiction. Rig to answer. Force. Machine. I was food. Do a particular. Spot. Shit. We were as a bye. As a blood. I was even which website. Been fiction, but my nature intention me. Hands, bits, my need for science fiction, art to find. No, some nature, lexical, complex, objectionable. Lay play their intention. Whipped up some query. Dimensionalized hands, so to wait. Hardly.
I have never heard anything like that.
Yeah, like, you know, I read the kind of center parts before, and just figuring out how to represent the stuff all over the page, like the second passages, right, was very, like it took a while for me to figure out how to represent that on the page. And then once I kind of figured it out, I mean, it was really like, just every couple of months I'd go in and I'd take some of the words and I'd adjust them a little bit, or like I'd make something larger, I'd put some more kind of range along the baseline, the leading and the tracking, being super graphic design nerdy right now. But then also just started thinking about what it means to imagine this kind of concept of, say, glitch. You know, to imagine a concept of like what happens when the machine kind of, you know, engages and breaks down. But then there's also the aspect of it that, like, in a book that a lot of people, you know, might not think has a lot of sort of lyric poetry and like it's kind of poetry that's an outpouring from a single subject soul, right? Like I was also a little bit feeling a little bit pugnacious to just decide, like, let's just have so many eyes, right, that everything turns into this kind of viral eye. And then the poems kind of like go, all right, we're gonna do some other things now after that one in that sequence. So yeah, I mean, yeah, literally like for real, that was like a world premiere of me trying to read that poem in a room with folks with all of the other layers. So thank y'all for being here for that.
It's extraordinary.
Thank you. Thank you.
You read a poem by, you know, two roads diverge in the other word. And then you see Frost, you see the recording of Frost reading it, the old video. You know, it's pretty similar to what you've read. When I was in college, I got to see Maya Angelou read some of her poems, and I was like, whoa, that's, I mean, I read the poems, I thought they were great, but then I saw her perform them, and it was a different experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what you're doing, the difference between what he just did and me paging through the poem, kind of baffled, there's a huge gap there. And you once said, in one of your essays, you said the poem is not complete until I perform it. What do you mean by that? Is it just is the poem on the page just a script? Is it like a play script that only is complete when it's performed?
So I think that what I'm saying is that there is a moment in which the poem exists for other people, right? Now, some of these poems, a poem like that one,
yes,
right? I have to demonstrate the way I kind of hear it in my head. But but that in some ways is I don't know, if anybody here grew up like reading comic books, or even goes back, you know, every issue of Spider-Man you read, at some point Spider-Man has to restate what his powers are in case it's the first time you've ever read a Spider-Man comic.
Right.
So like they don't know if you're their first one. So it's like, I'll use my Spidey sense gained by being bitten by a radioactive spider in order to like that's a thing they have to do to get everybody on the same page.
Yes.
So on the one hand, if you've read Spider-Man and you're like, okay, I've read 50 issues, I know what's happening. You see that, but you don't see it in quite the same way. So for me, like the moment one of the letters on one of my poems does like this, like that, just even that, right? There are gonna be some folks who look at it like, yeah, okay, it's happening. And they've heard me read it before, read a poem like that before,
Yes.
so they kind of know a way of playing it,
Right?
right? Because the question when people ask me, like, how do you read this poem? And I respond in an absolutely not like cryptic, artsy way. I go like, well, you tell me, how do you read it? I'm literally saying, tell me.
But no one else could do it as well as you did it.
No one else could do it the way I do it. I don't know about as well.
Like Ada Limon, beautiful poet.
Yeah.
But I can imagine other people reading the poems, and it would be just as lovely as her reading the poems. But I can't imagine anyone else reading your poems, and it would be as good as what you just did.
But this is the way I think about it. I think of like the history of music, because once we're performing it, right, we're doing something very similar to what a musician would do, right? And there's a history of covers,
Okay.
right? Like somebody else, I could imagine somebody else could read that poem.
Having seen your video of it.
Yeah, and then be like, okay, I want my version of this to last 45 minutes.
Okay.
Right? And pulling it out in different ways.
Right.
Or they might bring multiple voices into it.
All right.
Like a major turning point for me, which actually typifies more of the rest of this book, was I did a reading at the Kelly Writers House in Philly. And I showed some of these poems that I kind of think of as my collage poems, like these are the collage poems that much of this book is. And I digitally projected it like I'm doing here, and I was like, what do y'all, I don't know. Like I was kind of, yeah. But what I learned was, and this was like really important, because one of the things that I think is kind of, in some communities, kind of conventional wisdom, right, is that you read a poem alone. Right? Like some folks, that's like it's a solitary thing. In some communities like that. And then like sometimes there's a poetry reading, but you're kind of there and watching and receiving it.
Right.
Not all. And there are lots of folks who, would even push back on the idea of like writing alone. Like some people like to write with other people. But that reading things alone, at some level I'm creating like these things that, like I said, these kind of raucous almost house parties. But then it goes to one person and they read it on their own. Well, when I went to Philly, they told me that, oh no, we read this together. Like we read it, like a classroom of 12 people read it together.
Like a choral reading?
It was
or
like,
one at a time?
Well, like as a kind of a choral reading.
Okay.
And their engagement with it was not interpretation in like a fusty way of like, well, this is what it means, but like, what is being interpreted by my reading it this way?
Yeah.
What do we imagine collectively from this poem?
Right.
So for me, like the idea that I could bring a lot of voices into a poem, still oftentimes because of my own like, conventional wisdom, adherence to that moment, was like, oh, but people are gonna read these by themselves. But the collage poems are the first time where I felt like natively people read them collectively. And that's why, when I said like, that essay, until I performed them, that was definitely what I believed up until that time. But now, I think it is reader engagement at some level.
In another essay, you said I write poems that cannot be read.
Yeah, they can't be read aloud. I can't do it.
Can you show us one of those?
Oh, yeah. All right, let's skip this section. This is pretty tame. You could do that. But say that poem there. Go back. Yeah.
That.
Yeah. So that's one of the collage poems.
Yes.
Right.
I've tried to compose poems I cannot read aloud, he wrote.
Yeah.
So what's the purpose of such a barrier, such a challenge? Is it an ironic response to being a black man in a country in which 200 years ago you would not have been allowed to know how to read?
Ooh, it is one part that. It's also part that oftentimes black people are a kind of surface upon which racial trauma is not only visited in the first place, but creates sites in which it's revisited. So just on a very like practical, personal level, I was reading these poems and I was always figuring out how to do it. But what that meant was when, let's say I'm reading a poem that's about the kind of spectacle of violence done to black people, right?
Okay.
And so like this kind of conflation, which is like a thing I think about a lot, this kind of conflation of entertainment and violence,
Yes.
particularly as visited on black folks. So I'm writing critiques of that, right? I'm writing poems that critique that, but then I perform them spectacularly, quote unquote. Not like I'm dope at that level, not that, but like in this kind of space where like
As spectacle.
as spectacle. Now, I'm not the first person to have ambivalence about that. That's one of the kind of, like tensions par excellence of like the 20th century of, in terms of Black performance and Black art making. Like, what does it mean to revisit a wound and create an experience of it that is aesthetically pleasing, but aesthetically pleasing to who, and like all that kind of thing. So I've been doing a lot of these poems, like kind of like the title poem of this one.
Right.
And I just kind of hit a place where I was like, I feel a certain level of like a self-destructive quality in doing that. And I see some poets in this room right now who, might have experiences like that. And I was trying to figure out like how to keep writing and creating the things that were in my mind as I was thinking through these things.
Right.
And make them. And so one thing that is an aesthetic thing about a poem like this that we're looking at like this, which is a part of the Shuttle Black Getting Up epic, was I began thinking about how sampling in hip hop works.
Okay.
So sampling, as many people know, is like when you take a part of another recording and you put it into a new song and make a new composition out of it, right? And for years, there's been this kind of like, not as much now because sampling kind of got too expensive to do, but this kind of prohibition because of legal, prohibition that was not music, or that people were sampling because they didn't know how to play music, or sampling because they couldn't afford instruments. If anybody wants to hear me go off on that, I can do that later. But the thing that I found really interesting about sampling wasn't the bass line in and of itself that was being used from another site. It was the sonic texture, like what Western music theory would call timbre, right? Like there is the difference in the literal sound of this bass line played, let's say in a studio in 1981 by a particular player who has a particular setup in a particular room, versus the drums that might be taken from something in 1970, right? And that has its own kind of sound characteristics. And whatever other sampled elements are all from these different sort of time places.
Okay.
And the issue with...
You can see that playing out here.
Right. So the issue with InDesign, right, is unless I change the typeface every letter, it all looks really smooth. The texture is one texture. And so what I began to learn was like what appealed to me about sampling wasn't the existence of Queen's Another One Bites the Dust bass line. It was the quality of the sound, the timbre of that sound, juxtaposed with this other texture from the drums, from the horns, from the rapper themselves. And so what I looked at with that, beyond the kind of like subjecthood of like being from a culture of people who were radically decontextualized, right, removed, placed into a new, recontextualized somewhere else, and then become an anchor for that new context. Like, sampling is time travel. Sampling is the ability to say that 2015, 1981, 1966, and 1973 can all coexist in a now.
And you're referring to different advertisements, typography that are being drawn from different sources. Some are very old-timey, some are more recent.
Oh yeah, and so each bit of that collage, right? Like if I look at that one, I'd say that's probably around 50 sources, probably. So each one of those has their own texture.
And you think of it as a poem, not a collage.
I do. I think, well, collage can be a part of a poem. I mean, if we're talking about the modernists, right? Modernists did a lot of collage in their work, not necessarily visually, but they used a lot of sort of, appropriated texts and, that kind of a thing.
But this is not a poem you perform.
I wouldn't perform this poem, and the reason why is, at some level, it's practical. If I give every typeface in one of my poems a voice, right, its own voice, then if I'm doing like 50 voices, it's going to sound like the Tasmanian devil, right? And at that point, and this I think is actually very important, at that point, anybody in this room who can see the page will do a truer reading of the poem than I could do live. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Like let me see if I can find a good example on like a larger page. Okay, oh yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so super nerdy moment. If you have a letter in English and you cut it along the vertical, You can turn that into a partial aspiration. Go like, if that, like with the I at the end of I Imagine I'm in Science Fiction Always, it was half cut off the page. So it's just, like we can kind of hear that, okay, I see how you do that. But how do you do that along the horizontal? Like, that's not what that says, right? But when you're reading it and looking at it, you go, oh, it's cut, so it's behind or something like that. You are literally imagining this piece in your head better than I could perform. Because if I try to say over and make it as legible as over is on this page, but still try to eliminate it along this sort of horizontal, I'm not reading this poem anymore, right? Now I could do it kind of like, something that I've been thinking about a lot is like alt image,
Right.
like alt text, something that people do for accessibility. That's something that's a possibility, right? And it's funny how so much of that, is around, accessibility, critical disability, like all of these things. But for me, quite literally, also, like, there's something different, I think, to going, oh, line interrupting, oh, another line interrupting, oh, there's another line interrupting, oh. Like, yeah, I could do that. But when you look at this, you just see it and work it in there. You recognize that there's a simultaneity, even if you choose one thing to go on.
So the poem exists as we see it.
Yeah,
In that moment.
In this case, it is as you see it in that moment.
These poems make me very uncomfortable.
Oh, nice.
They don't feel like poems to me.
Yeah. So I mean,
This is all part of your...
this is a part of my evil
It is.
scheme, right?
It is. I know it is.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Yes.
we have the concrete poets of, South America. We have poetry comics. We have
Right.
visual poetry. Like, we have these things. And I do think about these more as things that are read than things that are looked at. Like, I do think the interface with them is, okay, let me read it. Now, that's just like, I believe artistic intention works. I believe it exists.
Right.
But y'all get to do whatever you want. So when I'm saying like, oh yeah, I think that you could still do this, you'd be like, no, I can't, or no, I won't. But in my head, to me, if I designed these to be visual in the sense of like a piece of visual art,
Right.
there are things that I would do very differently. And I have done those things in other places. But for me, this is still kind of bound lovingly in a system of reading. And so even some of the visual references through it, like they're still diagrams. Again, it's like pictures that we read to understand something.
Right.
And so, a lot of the poems do that, although some do not.
The use of advertising seems
Yep.
to me, particularly in an with old-timey graphics, problematic, purposely problematic.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the history of black people and advertising in the 19th century,
Yep.
in that they were being
Yeah.
sold off.
Advertised as sold or advertised as running away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why I wanted to start with those two poems we began with at the beginning, because
Yeah.
it's very clear what you were doing in those poems. We can all recognize the poems, we can see the themes. But you argue, and I'm starting to see, that these poems are just as thematic, just as evocative.
Yeah. I mean, so this poem right here is, I'm just going to make sure I get the title right because there's several. So each of these poems, so that one is Figure 1, Ease My Mind Shell, and it's a field holler helmet. So the cycle of this kind of group of poems is called Dark Matter Armor Reflex. Each poem juxtaposes a component of body armor with a musical style or rhetorical style from the African diaspora. So field holler is sort of like one of the precursors of blues, kind of exists between the sort of space of a spiritual and blues, because during Reconstruction, oftentimes people would still be working the land, but now as sharecroppers, they might be working more independently, and they didn't need to sing to create a rhythm that could make working more effective, right? So they would just call out these field hollers, or sometimes they're called arhulis, right? So this is like an individual lament. So I associated field hollers, right, with a kind of existential, mental space of harm. Of the armor pieces, this is also probably the one that's the most personal, because I'm a migraineur, I'm an insomniac, I'm an ADHDer. So at the bottom, you can kind of see upside down, like some of the paperwork from my migraine medication integrated into that space. And the repurposed kind of MAC line is also sort of like a brief, like sort of like assessment of what my themes in a poem are. Now the challenge for these poems for me was the formative typography poems, like the ones I showed in the beginning. I used to say, oh, a person could read these any way they wanted to, right? And I felt like that was true. But they were still basically organized, so like you start at the top left, and you can go crazy in the middle, but once you get to the bottom right, that's when you're done.
Right.
So in order to really break that, I kind of had to work like fractally.
Right.
So any part of the poem you enter kind of operates and I think kind of works sort of a modular sort of a thing. And you can accrete, you can collect more. And this is a term of neurodivergent poetics that a colleague of mine, Dr. Jessica Horvath Williams, coined. She says that neurodivergent poetics, the paradigms are multiplicity, excess, simultaneity, accretion, and association, right? And she's kind of digging into these, and I will nerd out about that at some other time. But for me, these poems accrete. And the fact of the matter is, like Square Biz, like when I'm doing one of these collage-based poems, usually I don't know if it's gonna work until I'm like between 60 and 75% through with the process. They are always waiting for this one thing to happen that suddenly makes them go bing, and now it connects. But that one thing can't necessarily be sequentially based, right? There's a couple of poems in this book where I was thinking more about comics, and these are like the newer poems, and so those do kind of have like a left to right sort of a reading orientation. By the time I got to those, I was like, yeah. But most of the poems, I mean, like there's probably, what would I say, like maybe 50 or so discrete collages in this book.
They're fascinating.
And like 2 of them break that rule as far as I think about it. And so that's pretty good.
I've never seen anything like it.
Thank you. I'll show y'all one of the comic-y ones. So, oh yeah, this is a jazz visor. Yeah, so the things that protect your eyes, so you can kind of see some aspects of that. This is a dub mask. This is a, call and response gorget, that's neck armor. This is a sol pauldron, like shoulder armor. This is a rear brace. This is a brag wrap rear brace. So like, protects the bicep area. This is, what is the armor form for elbows? Oh yeah, cooter. This is a crunk cooter. This is the first more like comic-oriented, super comic-oriented ones. It was a more recent revision. And this is a G-Funk vambrace. Vambraces are the forearms, where you oftentimes will see like tats identifying your neighborhood and all that kind of stuff. This is a this is a patent Juba gauntlet, so gloves, like, and patent Juba is with like, ham bone, where you been? Right, that sort of thing. Breaking microphones, lavaliers. This is a beat tape cuirass. Cuirass are chest armor and back armor, but of course, a lot of times they didn't want to do back armor because that would suggest you were running away from an enemy. But this is actually the first of these that I did. Like, this is the first one, and I kept it because I thought it was I enjoyed it. This is after the gut punch blues response. This is a blues placard and fold, so your gut and your upper groin. This is a twerk tacit, so this protects the hips and the groin. This is a house music codpiece, so protects the genitals. These are pan logo quisa, protects the thighs. Gospel Pauline protects the knees. Martello Greaves protects the shins. This is the most comic booky one. And this is an Anthem Sabaton or foot armor, protect the feet. And this is a chant shield. This is the poem that I wrote 2 days before George Floyd. Yeah, so it was a night, and I was like, oh, I'll make a poem, and that's what I made. And then this is a loop redoubt.
We are the first people to see these, besides your friends and
to see
editor.
them all, yes, all collected, all finalized. I put some up in a studio space, some of just these, right? You're all the first people to see the entire book.
And
like
their
period.
publisher has shipped copies here for us to sell tonight,
Absolutely.
for you to sign.
I will happily do
This
that.
is a fascinating night. I'm so grateful you came. It's really a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you
I
so
would
much.
keep you here all night, but I know people want to talk to you too. So thank you very,
Thank you.
very much. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
So yeah, as Ron was saying, we encourage you to just meet Doug at the back of the room, where he will be signing this really amazing book. And I do want to say one big announcement, which is just today we announced that Ada Limon, who is the current United States Poet Laureate, she will return to the library for her last event, unfortunately, with us as the Poet Laureate, on Thursday, April 17th. And we are going to release tickets for that on March 20th. So you can go to loc.gov/poetry to get those beginning on March 20th. And that she's going to be giving a lecture on poetry. So let's thank Doug and Ron for being here, and join Doug at the back of the room.